Hi, welcome everyone to tonight's program. It's titled YPL Presents A Tale of Love and Survival with Shelley Greenspan. Shelley is the daughter of two Holocaust survivors from Hungary. She grew up in the Bronx and lived in Israel during her high school years. She recently retired from a 40-year career in international banking. She lives in Irvington, New York, with her husband and two grown daughters who moved to Kingston, New York. She started telling her mother's story in 2020 during COVID to give her a sense of purpose during those scary times. She wants to teach the stories of individuals that survived the Holocaust to inspire people to treat others with dignity and respect, to fight against bigotry of all kinds. And I just wanted to let everyone know that tonight's program is co-sponsored by the Yonkers Historical Society. So thank you so much, Shelley, for being here, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone who's listening. You really honor me by hearing my mother's story. As Michael said, both my parents are Holocaust survivors. They're from northern Transylvania and present-day Romania, which has historically been Hungary. But I know more about my mother's story. My mother was fortunate that she had surviving family members. Unlike my father, he was the sole survivor of his immediate family. So my mother told me stories, and I heard stories from my aunts and from my cousins that she told some of the stories too. So I had a little more color about her story. But here is a picture of my mom. It was taken at a family bat mitzvah, and you could see that she was full of life and loved a good party. She was warm. She loved her family. She loved her friends, and she was just being with her. It was like being around a big hug and a warm bowl of matzo ball soup. She was just very comforting, loving. I don't know anybody who, not to exaggerate, but I really don't know anyone who didn't like my mom. She was just that kind of person. So, I was always puzzled, like how in the world, knowing what I know about her story and all the horrors that she went through and all the losses that she endured, how did she turn out this way? How did she make a life for herself? How was she so full of joy? And when it comes down to it, I think she had really two critical things going for her that kept her going all through the horrible years of the war. She had hope, and she had someone to lean on. She was fortunate enough that she was with her older sister, Sarah, throughout the entire ordeal. And her sister gave her hope. They helped each other, they supported each other, and she never really lost hope that, one day the hellish nightmare would be over and she would be reunited with family. And her sister Sarah was with her, all the way through. So that was a big comfort. Now, my mother grew up in a small village called Borșa, Romania, which is in northern Transylvania, as I said, in present-day Romania. But historically, it was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. She was one of 6 children. She lived in her maternal grandparents' house. The town is absolutely beautiful. This is a stock photo because I'm not a good photographer, but it really does look like this. It looks like Switzerland a little bit. It's surrounded by mountains. A river runs through it. It's very green, and there's a lot of timber forests. That was a big industry. But my mother grew up on a dairy farm. She was quite prosperous, the family was. This is a picture of the house. The house became a post office. My mother went back for a visit in 1972. That's her on the left in front of the house. And then I was fortunate enough to be able to make a trip there in May of 2019. And it looks pretty much the same. And that's my daughter, Emily, and I in front of the house. Now, we really wanted to, we were very excited, and we really wanted to go inside, take pictures, explore a little bit. But the librarian was the librarian, I'm sorry, not the librarian, the post office, the postmistress. Librarians are lovely people. This postmistress was not so lovely. And she, even though we had a Romanian tour guide and she explained that we came from a long way away and it meant a lot to us, the woman was having none of it. No pictures. No, you can't look in the back. No, it's blocked. No, 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 no. So I was kind of disheartened and we left. And but we went a few doors down and there was a gate and there were two women standing on the other side of the locked gate. And the tour guide told them the story. And she said, I can't believe she wouldn't let you in and was so rude. We'll let you into the back of the house so you can see what the back looked like. So there is the back of the house. And that kind of, I don't know, I just felt very good right then. I felt like I could picture my parents, my mother rather, and her siblings running around in the backyard. I could picture the cows and the horses. And my mother would always tell me that she could see the Carpathian Mountains from her bedroom window. And I never believed her. Kids always think their parents are exaggerating. I thought, a little hill or something. But no, you could really see these beautiful Carpathian Mountains. And so that made me feel good. And I took some dirt from the ground there, put it in a bag and took it home with me. And yeah, it made me feel a lot better. It's like people everywhere, right? There's nice ones and not so nice ones. So I experienced both of those things in Romania. So I will introduce you now to the immediate family. This is a limited family tree. This is my mother. These are my mother's parents. This is Nellie and Eliezer Meyer. And the house they lived in was actually belonged to Nellie's parents. Eliezer Meyer was kind of a poor boy, but he was very learned and he was just lovely, a lovely man, had a twinkle in his eye, was very gentle. And so he was welcomed into the family with open arms. But it was Nellie that, had the money and the power. And here are the children, as much as I had pictures of them. Starting from the left, the oldest one was Joseph, the oldest brother, 6 years older than Lily. And he was quiet and serious. And then came Sarah. She was the oldest daughter. And she was in many ways kind of the star of the family. She was beautiful. She was intelligent. She was a little bit rebellious. She actually landed in jail as a teenager. She was involved in some anti-fascist activities. There was a fascist party, the Iron Guard, at the time in Romania. And luckily, Eliezer Meyer was able to bail her out of jail. So, but she believed in causes. Then came Brother Bill now, and his son, Neil, is on this call today. Now, Bill and Lily were very much alike in temperament. They were close in age. And unlike Joseph and Sarah, they took life lightly. They weren't very serious. They loved to have a good time. They had a lot of friends. Bill had a lot of pets. And they were just fun-loving. And my Aunt Terry told me and they both loved a good practical joke. And my Aunt Terry told me that Bill, she told me a lot of stories, but one story about Bill, just to give you the sense of the personality, he would have to go to synagogue every Friday night with his father, and he would get bored. He didn't want to be there. He couldn't sit still. So it was a rural town, so muddy streets, they weren't really paved, and men would wear their boots that were muddied, and they would take the boots off, put them in the vestibule, and go into the sanctuary, put on slippers. So what does Bill do? To amuse himself during the services, he starts to hide the men's boots. And then they go out of services, and oh my God, where are the boots? I could have sworn I put them there. And Eliezer Meyer, he kind of knew it was his son, and he kind of pretended to scold him to save face, but he had a twinkle in his eye the whole time, and he couldn't hardly help from laughing himself. He had that same kind of sense of humor. And my mother had this, she was no slouch either when it came to pranks and kind of getting her way. She was jealous of Sarah. Sarah was, she was always being compared unfavorably to Sarah. Why can't you be, dignified like Sarah and good in school and this and that? And to make matters worse, she had to wear Sarah's hand-me-down clothes. And that did not sit well with her because my mother was a fashion plate, even from when she was a little girl, so she didn't like that. So her mother, Nellie, would send her out to neighbors with some food because the family was well-to-do, but their neighbors weren't. A lot of the neighbors were living hand to mouth, and the family had a general store. They had a dairy farm, a vinegar factory, lots of businesses. So Nellie would send out Lily with a big basket of food, breads and cheeses and vegetables and whatnot. And Lily decided to take advantage one day and empty her closet of all the hand-me-downs and put them in the bottom of the basket and went to the neighbors and gave the neighbors the food and the clothes. And the next day, Lily's not coming down. And Nellie goes up and says, "What's going on? Why aren't you dressed? Why aren't you ready for school?" And she says, "I have nothing to wear." She says, "What do you mean? You have a closet full of clothes?" She says, "No, look, it's empty." "Lily, what did you do with your clothes?" "Mom, you said to be charitable. I gave them to the neighbors yesterday with the food." So her mother was plenty mad, but what could she do? Lily had clothes made just for her. So that's and my mother would tell me that story decades later, and she would slap her thigh and she would laugh, and she just thought it was she was still very amused by the prank that she pulled back then. It was very cute. And then my mother had a younger brother, Yehuda, and a younger sister, Blima, but I don't have any photographs of them, sadly. So the family had really a nice life. They had really no incidents of anti-Semitism, except when my mother was 3, there was a fire in town. The Iron Guard burnt a lot of Jewish homes, but their home was spared. And, my mother preferred not to tell me that kind of story, but I found out when she did a tape of testimony, that's when I found out about the fire, and her cousin Zita confirmed it. So, but aside from that, that's not a small thing, but aside from that, there's always anti-Semitism in Europe. It's just there is here in the United States too, right? But anyway, they lived very comfortably. They lived among Jews, non-Jews, and they really didn't have a sense of impending danger until it was 1940, August 1940. What happened? Hungary was allied with the Nazis, with Germany. And as a kind of reward, Germany decided that Hungary should regain some of the lands that they had lost with their defeat in World War I. So part of the land here in yellow, this is around where Borša is, but this was northern Transylvania, which had been part of Romania since the end of World War I, was now annexed back to Hungary. And not only that, but so they also, the Germans gave them parts of the old Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia and everything. So how did the Jews of northern Transylvania feel about this? Well, at first, there's anti-Semitism in Romania, there's anti-Semitism in Hungary. They weren't too alarmed. And in fact, some of them may have been at first a little glad about it. The older people never really learned how to speak Romanian. They spoke Hungarian. That was their historical language there. And a lot of Transylvanian Jews fought in World War I to defend Hungary. So they had some loyalty. So they weren't alarmed at first. But they were very, very quickly disillusioned because the Hungarians immediately passed very severe anti-Jewish laws. So the new laws banned Jews from working in many of their professions and businesses. Many had no way now to earn a living. Jewish children couldn't attend secular school any longer, so my mother's formal education ended at the 8th grade. They did still have Cheder, or Hebrew school. My mother wrote and read in Yiddish. And, just to, really give the Jews the business a little more, the Jewish businesses were forced to stay open on the Sabbath, which is a day when no religious Jews should conduct any work at all. So her grandfather, rather than be open on the Sabbath, closed his general store. He could afford to do that because they still had the farm and they could get by, but a lot of Jewish families, could not. So his general store is shuttered. Racial laws were passed in Hungary, similar to those that had earlier been passed in Germany, as to how a Jew is defined. Marriage between a Jew and non-Jew was now banned, and even dating a Jew could land a non-Jew in jail, I guess both of them. Because, the Hungarians took to heart the Nazi philosophy that Jews were a lesser race. To mingle, with the Hungarian population would be to somehow pollute it. So there should be no relations between the two. And to make matters worse, Lily's town of Borsha was a small village. There weren't any hotels. And the Hungarian soldiers knocked on her door one day and said, "We need lodging. You people don't need all this room, right? You can spare a room or two, can't you?" Of course, they had no choice. So they now had troops living with them, living with the enemy. And they were now made to feel like unwelcome guests in their own home, which had been such a warm and loving, beautiful place prior. So back to the family. So Hungary had something specific to Hungary. It was called the Hungarian Labor Service System. And this was designed for so-called undesirable men to do military service. And mainly the undesirable men were Jewish men. And some of them were as old as 50. I mean, they weren't that selective. They just took them if they had a reason to. So these men were given no arms, no uniforms, and had the most dangerous and back-breaking work to perform. They had to dig trenches, repair rail tracks. They had to even clear minefields. And, depending on who your Hungarian army sergeant was, you would get treated halfway decently, perhaps, or you would just be beaten, kicked, humiliated, starved. And as the war went on, the conditions got worse and worse, So Brother Joseph was of age, and he was called up to perform this forced labor. So he left home, no choice. And, they could sense that things were getting worse and worse. And actually, the Romanian housemaids who worked for Nellie, they said, "Let us take the children. We'll hide them up in the mountains. They'll be safe." And the parents and grandparents didn't know what to do. And they were, what a difficult decision to let your children go. And, you don't know if you'll see them again. You don't know how safe they'll be. In the end, they decided it was better if they all stayed together. They still felt they could protect their children. Unfortunately, it was not a good decision that they made, because in early 1944, Hungary could see the direction of the war had turned, and that Germany was losing the war. They tried to secretly get out of their alliance with the Germans. But the Germans got wind of this, and in March of 44, they occupied Hungary. Now, Hitler knew he was losing the war. I mean, the Germans knew they were losing the war, but rather than sort of marshal his dwindling resources on, mobilizing his troops, he said, "No, I'm going to spend my last resources and my energy on trying to murder all the Jews of Europe." And, he said, he thought to himself, "I may not be able to win the war, but I'll win the war against the Jews." So, it was really the end of the war. That's part of the horrible tragedy. So close to the end, but, he had to get his hands on the Hungarian Jews. And they were the last population to be selected for mass extermination. But they couldn't have done it alone. The Germans couldn't have done it alone. There weren't that many of them that occupied Hungary, so they relied on the Hungarians. Unfortunately, most of them were only too happy to help in the effort. So working together with the police, the military, and other officials, they forced the Jewish population from their homes and concentrated them into ghettos. So they invade in March. In April of 44, shortly after Lily's 17th birthday, her family and all the Jews in Borsha and all over Hungary were transported to ghettos. And the nearest, except Brother Joseph didn't go. He was already called up to forced labor, but the rest of the family, minus Nellie's mother, she died of liver cancer, but her father and the rest of the family all packed up the house, given very little notice, taking a small bag. They were told they would be back, but yet the Hungarians made sure they took no valuables. Oh, you don't need them. And they would, even beat you up if they suspected you were smuggling something. So they went with very little. And they got to the ghetto, which is in this town called Vishudasus. It was a neighboring town, had a big Jewish population, which is a reason they decided to establish the ghetto there. So Jews from neighboring towns were crammed into that ghetto. Just to show you, this synagogue no longer exists, but just to show you that it was a big town. They had enough of a population to have this beautiful synagogue, which survived the war, only to be destroyed in 1977 by some Soviet-style, really ugly housing. They had, the Romanians under USSR, they had no appreciation or respect for Jewish culture, and they just tore down the synagogue. Here is a photo. So when we visited Romania, we also went to see where the ghetto would have been, and it was very haunting experience. There was a hospital within the ghetto walls, and this is the exterior of it, and this is the interior. It was just, I don't know, it felt haunted to me. It was just very sad and disturbing. But they were crammed into the ghetto. They were fortunate enough to have a cousin that lived there, and her place was within the ghetto walls, because it wasn't enough that they sent you to the ghetto. You had to knock on someone's door and ask to stay with them. There was no assigned housing. You just had to make your way and find a place to live. So they were able to cram in with their cousin. Conditions were really grim. They went hungry. They didn't have any valuables to trade with. They could barely lie down and sleep at night. And they were there for only 1 month, though, unlike, the Jews of Poland and other places in Eastern Europe that were in the ghetto for many years. They were only there for 1 month. Why? Because they had to get them to the extermination camps. The war was almost over. So they stayed there for 1 month, and the Russian army was advancing. They had no time to lose. So the whole family, minus Joseph, and including Nellie's father, they were all packed up in cattle cars, shoulder to shoulder. There were 8 of them. They took it was a 2-day ride, crammed in like that, no privacy, no food, no water, until they got to Auschwitz in Poland. So they open up the train doors. You have the Nazi guards shining flashlights in their eyes, German shepherds straining at their leashes, barking, ready to pounce. And the Nazis say, "Rouse, rouse, get out quick." And immediately the men and the women were separated. So at that point, My mother, Sarah, and Nellie, they didn't see Bill or Eliezer Meyer anymore. The women were further ordered to line up and were sent either to the left or to the right. So my mother, Lily, and her older sister, Sarah, they were 17 and 21 at the time. They were ordered to the right, along with their mother, Nellie. But Yehuda and Blima, they were only 15 and 13 and probably looked their age. They didn't look any older than that. They were ordered to go to the left. Now, Nellie wouldn't leave her two youngest alone, so she crossed over to the left to be with them. My mother, Lily, she wanted to be with her mother too. She tried to cross over, and it was Sarah who pulled her back to the right. And that was the first time, but it wouldn't be the last time that Sarah would save my mother's life. Sarah was so smart. She noticed people on the left, young children, the elderly, the sick looking, and she just knew she had to keep my mother with her on the right. So it was May 24th, 1944, the same day they arrived in Auschwitz. Lily's grandfather, Moshe, her mother, Nellie, and her younger brother and sister, Yehuda and Blima, were put to death in the gas chambers. Now, there were 1.1 million Jewish prisoners in Auschwitz. The Jews of Hungary made up the largest percentage by country, 430,000. And of those, 80% were murdered upon arrival. So when we made our trip to Romania, we also went to Auschwitz. And it was almost 75 years to the date that, a good portion of my mother's family were murdered, that we were finally able to light memorial candles and say Kaddish for them. And here's a picture of that. So after the initial selection process, Lily and Sarah were alive. They were having to give up their clothing. They were given striped raggedy uniforms to wear, wooden clogs for shoes. And then every morning and every evening, they were forced to stand at attention, sometimes for hours. It was called appel, the roll call. And, they had to stand perfectly still. They had to be counted. It was just another form of cruelty. There was no reason to make them stand silent for hours, but, that's what they did. They were extremely sadistic. And they would pick people off the line at appel. You coughed, you looked down when you should have looked up, whatever it was, you didn't look so well that day, go off the line, only never to be seen again. And Sarah would make sure that she would kind of pinch my mother's cheeks, make sure she looked healthy, and stand still, Lily, don't make a move. And they did that twice a day, and they were just breathing a sigh of relief every time they got through with the roll call. Now, I don't know how it must have been beyond miserable, because they were there for a month and they were given no work to do. My mother said they were just kind of lying around. I guess they were trying to figure out what to do with them. And of course, by this time, they realized what had happened to their mother and two younger siblings. They knew from the other prisoners, what their fate was. And they had nothing to distract them. I mean, even forced labor might have been a relief of some sort, but no, I guess they couldn't figure out what to do with them right away. So, but about a month later, they were ordered back on the trains. My mother always with Sarah. And they were to go to another concentration camp called Stutthof, near Gdansk, Poland, near the Lithuanian border. It was another very, very long train ride in the cattle cars. And they did have a crematorium there too, but it was more not so much a death camp, it was more a forced labor camp. And of course, the forced labor was in service of the German war effort. So they put my mother to work in a grenade factory, and she had to stuff the grenades with chemicals, and was horrible. She was like breathing it in. She said it made her skin turn like bluish, but that was her job. And Sarah, who, as I said, was pretty sharp, she figured out that if you volunteered at the hospital, you can get a little more rations, extra rations. And those extra rations, those few extra crumbs, really could mean the difference between life and death, because the prisoners were fed a thin slice of bread in the morning and watery soup at night. So Lily and Sarah would meet at the barracks at night after they finished their hard labor and work. And Sarah would give my mother a little bit extra food. She was always making sure that, she would deprive herself to make sure that my mother kept going. My mother, the younger, weaker one. So the days stretched into weeks and into months with the same routine. Hard work, exhaustion, fear, and hunger were their daily lives. But Lily had Sarah's support, and Sarah had a mission to keep Lily alive. So they leaned on each other and tried their best to get through each day without giving into despair. So Lily and Sarah were interned at Stutthof for 5 months, from August 44 till January 45, when the Germans evacuated the camp to flee the advancing Russian army. Her entire unit of women prisoners were forced to march into brutally frigid conditions in threadbare uniform and in inadequate shoes. Some of them didn't even have shoes. Those who were too weak to go on were shot on the spot. Some of them actually almost froze to death standing up. It was a horrible, brutally cold winter, exceptionally cold that winter. So they marched like that for about 2 long days. And then Sarah said, we can't go on. And she noticed a farmhouse in the distance with some lights on. So they decided that they better make a break for it, because there's no way they're going to survive if they keep marching like this. They might as well try something else. They're probably not going to survive. So they did. They broke off the line. Sarah, Lily, and 3 women from their hometown that were together with them, they made a run for it. Nobody saw them leave. It was night. And they got to the farmhouse, and there was a big barn, hayloft, and they spent the night in the hayloft. And in the morning, the lady of the house entered the barn to feed the animals. And Sarah came down, and she persuaded the woman that they should help them because the Russians were on their way, and the Russians would reward her for helping the Jewish prisoners. And somehow she convinced them, and she said, well, you can stay and I'll feed you, and you could stay here, but I want you to help me with housework. I have a lot of housework. And they realized why she had a lot of housework. She had a house full of German soldiers that she was forced to tend to, but they were wounded. They were not in good shape. And Sarah spoke fluent German. The woman gave her like a headscarf and a dress, and she went in, and she was not disturbed by the soldiers, and they were able to stay for a few days and be fed and be safe for just a few days. But a few days later, there was a pounding on the door, and the Russian troops had arrived, and they forced open the door, and they see German soldiers there. They start shooting up the place, and they almost hit Sarah, and they started yelling, "Ivre, Ivre, we're Jews." But I think that's how you say it in Russian, but the soldiers didn't seem to understand. They may have been from Mongolia. I don't know, but very fortunately, that could have been the end for them. They could have ended many times, but the captain happened to be Jewish, and he understood, and he ordered them to stop shooting. And he realized that if, these women stayed there, the Russians were notorious, for committing rape, okay? So he didn't want to leave them where they were. So he took them to a hospital in Bromberg, which was not too far from where they were. And it was controlled by Russia at that point. It was in Poland, and there they stayed, and they were able to stay and recuperate for several months. You can imagine they were skin and bones. They were in really bad shape, but they were able to. It took them a few good months till they could, get on their feet again. It was April, and they felt strong enough, and the war was basically over there. And they said, let us make our way back to Borsha. So they did. sorry, I just wanted to show you a map of their kind of journey. Here is Borcha, the ghetto in Vichy de Sus, Auschwitz. This is Stutthof in Polish. Stutthof was actually the German name. Don't ask me how to pronounce this, but this is where the camp was. And then Bromberg was pretty close by. So it was a very, very long journey home. I don't know how long it took, but the trains were kind of running on no particular schedule. There were a lot of stoppages, but they got home, and they were the first ones to get home. And in their house, the house was still standing. In their house were other Jewish families from town were living there, and they said, "Stay here, live here." And they lived together, and they didn't know at that point who had survived, who hadn't. And it was a miracle who comes home, but Eliezer Meyer. Their father had survived at least, I believe, 3 concentration camps, as did Bill. He was also in multiple concentration camps. I think I'm forgetting the age. He was in his 40s, I guess, Eliezer Meyer, but he was very strong and miraculously. So he came home, and then Joseph came home next from forced labor. And then Bill was recuperating from typhus, but he survived and he came home. And I can't imagine the mixed feelings of joy, relief, and sorrow, because after all, Nellie didn't come home and Yehuda and Plima didn't come home. But to have that kind of survival rate was pretty miraculous. So the family were together. They lived for a while in Romania. My grandfather remarried. He married a lovely woman from the town that he knew before the war. And my Aunt Sarah married her cousin and childhood sweetheart. And Joseph found a wife for himself. And my mother met my father one day because my father had reestablished his father's leather business, and my mother reestablished her father's general store. And she would go to my father's store to buy leather goods because his partner was married to my mother's cousin, so they knew the store. Anyway, every time my mother would come to the store to buy goods, my father was never there. He was on business trips buying goods. So she was buying stuff on credit, and there was a very high rate of inflation. So, money becomes worthless after a while when you have a high inflation rate. So my father was looking at the books one day and says to his partner, Eli, he says, "Who is this Leah Davidovich running up these big bills? The money's worthless now." And Eli looked at him slyly and said, "Wait till you see Lily, and you'll forget all about the debts." And sure enough, finally, one day, my mother went into the store, and there was my father. And after a whirlwind courtship of 3 months, they were married. And they stayed in Romania for a while. They eventually went to Czechoslovakia, but the communists were taking over, and it was getting harder to cross the borders. They had to smuggle themselves. It was a difficult situation, but a lot of Jewish refugees wound up in U.S. occupied Germany as a sort of a stepping point to get to America. And that's what they did. Eventually, they found their way to Germany. Brother Bill was earning a living trading black market goods in Germany, and they decided to go too. They didn't move to Israel. The rest of the family did. My mother's father and sister and brother went to Israel, but my grandfather told my parents that try to go to America. You could always come back to Israel. You'll make money. You can always come back to Israel. But if you go to Israel first, it's very hard living there. That's what you should try to do. So they did. It took a number of years. When they went to Germany, the Germans were obligated to house refugees if they had any spare rooms. And my parents were sent to this professor and his wife who had a spare room. And they did not want to house these 2 young Jewish couples. That was their house. they didn't want to share it. And they tried to discourage my parents. You know, we were members of the Nazi party, this and that. And they said, okay, we understand, but we need a place to live and we're going to live with you. And here's our papers. And so my mother, as I said, was this warm, charming, wonderful woman. She actually felt sympathy for them because they had lost a son in the war. And my mother helped them in a lot of ways. She would give them cigarettes and chocolate and coffee. And they came to love my mother. And my mother said, you know, in her show tape, she said, people are people, you know, the Germans were people too. She had such a big heart. And they liked her so much that they took this photo, you know, when she left for the US, they were going to miss her. Incredible. So this is a picture of them in Munich. And while they were in Germany all those years, they only made it to the US in 1951. It really took a long time. I mean, the war ended in 45. They lived in Romania and Czechoslovakia for a while. I think they might have gotten to Germany in 47, 48. But anyway, while they were in Germany, I came across this document. I'm still somehow sorting through my parents' documents. My parents, unfortunately, are deceased, but they left behind a lot of papers. And for some reason, this really got me because this was her passport when she was living in Germany and she went to Israel to visit the rest of the family. And it says temporary travel document in lieu of passport for stateless persons and persons of undetermined nationality. Stateless persons. So, you know, my mother lost so much, you know, family members, her country. She was a stateless person. She was a refugee. I mean, what I can't imagine, but there it is in black and white. But there's my beautiful mother with a little smile on her face. She just remarkable. Anyway, so they lived in Germany, waiting to immigrate to New York. They were married rather in 1946. I wasn't born until 1956, 10 years later, which is a whole other story for another time. It took a long time for me to be born, but here's a picture of me at age 3 and my mom. And we had gone to visit Israel. And my parents never had a lot of money, especially in the earlier years. You know, they kind of scraped by. But really, family was so important. We were so happy and lucky to be living near Bill and my 3 cousins, Neil, Mark, and Karen. Neil is on the call today. And they were like my siblings because I was an only child. But, you know, even though Israel was so far away, whatever money they had, they made sure they went to Israel every few years. And there's a picture of one of our trips to Israel when I was 3 years old. And guess who visited us sometime in the 60s? I don't have an exact date, but my Aunt Sarah. And there she is. And here we are at a bungalow colony in Monticello, New York. That was the thing to do in those days in the summertime. All the Bronx people, the New York City people went up to the bungalow colonies to get some relief. And Sarah visited, and there's my Uncle Bill in the middle, and there's my mom on the right, the 3 siblings reunited. And I couldn't speak to her. I don't remember if I was 8, 9, or 10, something like, I think I was 8 or 9. Couldn't speak to her because she didn't really speak. She spoke a lot of languages, but English, not so much. But I just remember she was like my mom. She was like warm and friendly and just like, I just adored her. So much like my mother, and just a wonderful person. So I was, you know, that was wonderful, that trip that she made. So, you know, life went on for us. Life was good. We moved from the Bronx to Paramus, New Jersey, you know, with Uncle Bill and Terry and Neil, Mark, and Karen, my cousins, and went to Paramus High School, and everything was great. And until one day I was 16, And my mother got a letter from Israel, and she opened it up and she just broke down. She started crying hysterically. And my father and I didn't know what was wrong. And the letter was in Yiddish, and she kind of held it up to my father, and he read it, and he said, "Oh no." And it happened that her sister Sarah was very, very ill with cancer. And my mother she was just totally, I don't remember her crying before then, but she totally lost it. She totally lost it. Because Sarah was more than a sister to her. She was like her role model, beacon of life, and her savior, really. So my mother kind of, I don't blame her. It was kind of impulsive decision, but she decided to move us to Israel. We were going to move to Israel, and she was going to help take care of her sister. And so we did. We packed up and we moved, and it was quite a shock to me. I didn't know what to expect. I was 16, had all my friends and family and cousins in Paramus, and but I don't remember ever really complaining or telling her, "Gee, Mom, I'm nervous. I don't speak Hebrew. What am I going to do?" I just kind of went with it because I guess that's part of being a child of a survivor. You always feel like you have to, at some level, take care of your parents. They're just a little bit fragile somehow. And so I don't know, I kind of swallowed all my anxiety, and we moved to Israel. But unfortunately, by the time we got there, I don't know, it was a few months after that letter, I guess. But anyway, she was pretty sick. And when we got there, she was not holding down her food anymore. And it was very, very sad. And not too long after that, she passed away. And there we were living in Israel. And my mother still had, her brother Joseph, and her father and stepmother were alive. About a year after that, her father died. And it was just hard for them living there. They learned how to speak Hebrew reasonably well, but it was in the early 70s. The Yom Kippur War broke out while we were there. It was a little bit of a struggle. So I graduated high school there. I was happy enough. I did miss, my family and friends back in the US. And we took a trip, what I thought was going to be just a summer vacation. We took a trip back went to Montreal, we went to Paramus, saw the family. And then my parents broke it to me that we weren't going to move back to Israel, that, it was too difficult. They had decided that, it would be better if they moved back. And I hadn't even said goodbye to my friends. I was kind of shocking, but again, I don't remember really putting up a big fight. And I guess I was a little ambivalent, because I thought, well, if I stay in Israel, I'll be in the army, but if I come home, I'll be in college, and that's exciting too. And, anyway, so bottom line, we moved back. And, despite the upheaval that it caused our family, my mother never regretted the move to Israel, because Sarah was more than a sister to Lily. She was a role model, her savior. And from Sarah, Lily learned important life lessons that were passed along to me as well. The lesson that sacrifices can be endured when there is love, that even a starving sister will give her portion to a younger, weaker sister, as Sarah did for Lily. In return, Sarah found her own purpose to live. She had to survive for Lily's sake. The lesson to never give up hope in the face of unimaginable odds. The lesson that in this world you can face almost anything if you have someone to lean on, as Lily and Sarah had in each other. And here's another picture of my mom at my daughter's bat mitzvah. Again, happy. And the last picture of you, of her. So thank you so much, everybody. I'm honored that you listened to my mother's story. And I am a living connection to the history and lessons of the Holocaust. And now that I've shared my story, you are a living connection too. So thank you. Thank you once again. I'm sorry if this went on a little bit long, but but that is the story, and I very much appreciate you honor me by listening. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. And my computer apparently had a mental breakdown because I couldn't get on until this last piece of it. So will I be able to see the rest of it on YouTube?
Michael, I think Michael said it's being recorded, right?
Good.
Yes.
Good. All right. So then I get to see the first. I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay.
Chrome was not responding, but that was such an extraordinary story and so touching, heartwarming, inspiring, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. I don't know if anybody has any questions or. It's a lot to unpack. But yeah, I feel in this day and age, unfortunately, you know, we think we've learned the lessons of the Holocaust, but it, you know, they bear repeating.
Do you think you would have liked to have stayed in Israel?
That's a good question. You know, I think I could have made it work. You know, I could have made it work. I was, you know, flexible and young enough at the time that it would have been okay. I don't regret that I didn't stay. I was very happy to be back and to, you know, go to school here and, you know, still keep very close touch with the family in Israel and visit them and all of that. I don't know, it would have been a different life, you know, for sure. Who knows in life, you know, which way you're going to go. So,
yeah.
I mean, I enjoyed it a lot. I was, you know, it was hard work. I didn't speak a word of Hebrew when I graduated from high school there. So it was rough. It was really rough. But yeah, no, it was, well, the nice thing was I got to know my grandfather and step grandmother a little bit and, you know, the cousins that were there. So that was nice.
Yeah. Where did they live? You probably said that.
No, I didn't. They lived in Ramat Gan and, you know, Givatayim. These are suburbs of Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
And then we had family in Haifa too. My grandfather lived in Haifa.
Yeah.
And my Uncle Joseph lived outside of Haifa. So, and we had relatives in Sarah's daughter, Shoshana, also died of cancer, you know, very sad. Lost her at age 50, but they lived in Jerusalem. So, yeah, we kind of got to go in between all those places. And then my cousins Neil and Mark visited me when I lived there. So that was a lot of fun too.
That was, Michelle, that was a summer of 1973, and I remember you studying so arduously. You had those major high school exams, and you were studying so hard.
Yeah. Had I known now what I know then, I was too serious, right? I mean, come on. What were they going to do? Fail me? And so what, right? I took, you know.
The only time I've been in Israel, it snowed like crazy and it was freezing cold.
Oh, wow.
Really? That's unusual.
Yes, it was.
Wow. Interesting. When was that? Was that in Jerusalem or were you further up north?
Oh, we went all over and it was in, when did we go? It was after 83. So it must have been like 86 maybe about. Freezing in the winter. But the Dead Sea was still warm.
Yes. It's an amazing country. There's
it's extraordinary. And we were up in the kibbutz Hagoshrim, way in the north, and in the middle of the night we heard gunshots, and we thought, "Oh God, we're gonna have to run like crazy," but we didn't. But there was an exchange across the border that night.
Yeah, I remember living there, and particularly I was there during the Yom Kippur War, but I just remember being on a bus or something and the news would go on and everyone would go dead silent listening to what was happening. And there was I never felt, physically in danger or anything like that. But I remember those, the caravan of cars on Yom Kippur, which is usually you don't see any cars in the road. I remember all the army people being called up, and
I'm sure
it was very frightening. And I remember a siren went off and we had to go into the bomb shelter in the building.
Wow.
But it was kind of, when you're young and stupid, like we don't know. So we were volunteering at the hospital, rolling bandages. They put on good stuff on TV to watch at night, to keep people inside. You had to put your lights low so that, the planes wouldn't see you. It was kind of an adventure, in a way. But yeah.
Luckily with a good outcome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I will.
Oh, you're so welcome.
You again on YouTube so I can see the rest.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks. Great presentation.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you for being here. Mwah.
Thank you for sharing your story, Shelley. I just wanted to ask you one thing.
Sure.
Because I missed a lot of the beginning and I apologize for that. I had just gotten home and I'm like, oh, the program. I was wondering, did your parents talk a lot about their experiences? I must have missed
No, my mother would tell me the happier stories. She didn't tell me about the fire when she was 3 years old and the Iron Guard fascist party burnt the town down. Oh. She didn't tell me that, but she would tell me, funny things like the pranks that she pulled. She had a cousin that was a slicker and she told her to go ride the family cow. She said it was a horse. And, she would tell me these, the more lighthearted stuff. And I guess I learned more, from one of my cousin's kids had a presentation. So she interviewed my mom. And then very fortunately, my mother did a tape. So I learned a lot from that as well. But she kind of preferred to tell me the happier times. But I knew about Sarah. I knew that Sarah saved her life. And I knew how important Sarah was to her.
Right. Because it's interesting how you felt the need to protect your parents,
Yeah, there was always something there. I mean, even though, my mother was warm, bubbly, like she didn't wear this on her sleeve. She didn't have nightmares. It wasn't like a typical thing that you would think, but there was still something like, vulnerable there that I couldn't quite put a finger on when I was a kid, but it was always in my consciousness. So I just knew that I had to kind of behave in a certain way at certain times.
Right.
But yeah, that's,
it sounds like you were very blessed though. They sound like fabulous parents.
Thank you. They were. Indeed, they were. They were. I'm very, very, very fortunate.
Yeah. And thanks again for sharing.
Oh, you're so very welcome. You're so very well. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.